Thank you, and thank you all for coming. This is the most extraordinary event to come to Boulder, I would suggest, for a very long time. A creative caravan of writers and thinkers. The JLF, the Jaipur Literary Festival, in Boulder, no less. When I have told people elsewhere, all over the world, that this was happening, they said, "You're kidding me, Boulder?" I said, "You bet, Boulder." So we have the most extraordinary event here, because to have these 5 people on this stage is in itself an extraordinary achievement. Each, in their own way, a master, mistress of their discipline and their creativity, and we have very little time. So I'm going to introduce them to you individually, in reverse order, because I'm known to be obtuse, and hey, let's put the women first, why not? So to begin with, Laura Sims is a world-renowned storyteller, author, recording artist, and humanitarian who advocates storytelling as compassionate action for personal and community transformation. Her YouTube performance for Korean tale The Woodcutter, with voice and gesture in her own inimitable style, has thousands of hits. She teaches at NYU, Antioch, and the University of Utah, has directed Girls Write Haiti at the Hans Christian Andersen Storytelling Center, and co-directs Stories Without Borders. Her recent books are Our Secret Territory, The Essence of Storytelling, and Rope of Love. That is Laura Sims. Put your hand up, Laura, please. Christi Merrill. Now, Christi said sometimes people confuse her with Christopher Merrill. Frankly, I find that a little unusual and a little bit surprising. I did not confuse her with Christopher Merrill. She's an associate professor of South Asian literature at the University of Michigan and author of Riddles of Belonging, India in Translation, and Other Tales of Possession. Her translations from Hindi, French, and Rajasthani, did you get that? From Hindi, French, and Rajasthani, of the stories of Rajasthani writer Vijay Datta, as well as numerous essays on translation, have appeared in journals everywhere. She began reading Datta's work many years ago and liked it so much she decided to do something about it and translated them into English. She won the 2012 A.K. Ramanujan Award, and that is Christi Merrill. Now, Linda Hess comes to us with a slightly different academic discipline. She's the senior lecturer in the Department of Religious Studies at Stanford University. She specializes in Hinduism and writes on the poetry of North India's great 15th and 16th century poetry saints, their popularity, influence, and modes of performance. And she also researches the poetry of religious experience. We'd like to hear a lot about that if we can work it in today, Linda. She has published 3 books related to Kabir, The Bijak of Kabir, Singing Emptiness, Kumar Gandharva Performance of the Poetry of Kabir, and Bodies of Song, Kabir, Oral Traditions, and Performative Worlds in Northern India. Linda Hess. Marcia Douglas is a fellow Brit living in Boulder, and she's the author of the novels Madam Fate and Notes from a Writer's Book of Cures and Spells, as well as a poetry collection. Electricity Comes to Cocoa Bottom. I love that title. Her recent awards include an NEA Fellowship, and she performs a one-woman show, Natural Her Story. Well, that's right, isn't it? Natural, how do you say that? Her Story. So that is Marcia Douglas. And Vikram Chandra, many of you will have read his novels, I'm absolutely certain, if not in preparation for this event. He is described as one of those writers who really likes to spin a yarn. I hope we're going to get some of that today. Unlike many contemporary fiction writers whose focus is on their prose, Chandra, while stylish, is above all a storyteller. He has a background in film, script writing, and writing code, I think, too. You were a computer programmer for a long time. And he co-wrote the screenplay for the Hindi movie Mission Kashmir, and he's the teacher of creative writing at the University of California, Berkeley. He is the author of Geek Sublime, Sacred Games, a 900-page epic story focusing on a Sikh police inspector named Sartaj and his investigation into the suicide. Love and Longing in Bombay is all about storytelling and red earth and pouring rain. His honours include the Commonwealth Writers' Prize, the Crossword Prize, and the Salon Book Award. Now, this is an unusual discussion because we've got performance artists and people interested in the passion of prose, and the discussion is orality. And here is the question. It's a broad-based academic question from Walter Ong, who is one of the experts in orality, I am told. Oral literature, many consider to be passed on through the spoken word. And because it is based on the spoken language, it is said to come to life only in a living community. Where community life fades away, orality loses its function and dies. It needs people in a living social setting. To what extent, and obviously you'll have a cross discussion, this is not a lecture hall, to what extent do each of you agree or disagree with this, that oral literature needs a living social setting, and to what extent, this is the whammy, is it impacted by new media, multiplicities of platforms, and what do you five intend to do about it? Let's start with Marcia Douglas, you're the guest.
Okay, thank you, Claudia. Yes, so very good question, and maybe I should tell you a little bit more about my background. I was born in England, but I grew up in Jamaica. And for me, that is the living space out of which my creativity comes. Jamaica is such a very rich and varied language space. And I grew up, you know, my development as a writer / performer came not so much from reading as it did, I would say, from listening. I grew up with parents who were uneducated, however, they were amazing storytellers. Even recounting an everyday event, you know, something simple, would be told with a lot of vitality and energy and drama. Layer on top of that, another of my living spaces, so to speak, came from my father, who was a fire and brimstone preacher. You know, he was a street corner evangelist, you might say, and he would impromptu begin to preach on any corner in Jamaica. So you can imagine, as a little girl growing up and listening to that, it has to affect you in some sort of way as a creative person. And then too, there is, you know, you have to consider Jamaica as linguistic space, the Jamaican vernacular, which is very innovative, very much attuned to rhythm. And that too is added another layer of orality from which I now draw. And I would also include the music of Jamaica. Jamaica is music, and many of those rhythms, that sensibility, you know, it's become fodder for what I do both on and off the page. So that's how I would describe my living space in a nutshell, Claudia.
Thank you very much. Now, Laura Sims, how does what Marcia just said relate to your performance about the woodcutter? It's a Korean tale. What points of commonality? Because it's a funny thing, but orality is orality, and we're talking about delivering passionate messages through the spoken word. What do you take from what Marcia said and amplify how it relates to your experience?
Well, I think the way we grow up, so sorry. A storyteller in the modern world is extremely dangerous.
With or without a mic?
It's in answer to your original question, and maybe related to Marcia, that the new media in some ways has very little to do with oral tradition. Thank you. that's much better. Excuse me. I think it leaves a tremendous hunger for direct communication and for basically being alive, that the new media is, it's incredibly efficient and useful. I mean, without it I couldn't have contacted kids that I brought out of wars or do the work that I do in Haiti with girls in a camp. But at the same place, it exemplifies or it exaggerates the dislocation between human beings and each other and the natural world and really our inner selves, and both physically and emotionally, mentally, and spiritually. But it's very useful. So in some ways I feel that the storytelling that I do is like an emergency repair. And of course I am, like you, very, very influenced by my childhood. I grew up in a Romanian, Polish, Jewish family in Brooklyn after World War II. And my great-grandfather was a grand rabbi in Moldavia. And so I feel, even though I didn't know him, that, and I did go to Romania in search of fragments of that tradition, that I have this kind of resource within myself of the wisdom and passion, the profundity of the spoken word. I began as a poet and was busily, to the joy of my parents, I was doing something practical. I was getting a PhD when I accidentally told a fairy tale in Central Park in New York. And what happened in the event of telling the story was so remarkable in terms of what occurred between myself and the audience in that kind of living space between, that I sort of took a detour that I've been on now for 47 years of like, what is oral tradition in the contemporary world. So I've studied with many people. I was the student and a mentee of a Native American great storyteller in Elder among the Salish tribe. But in a way, what I've committed myself to is to find what the sort of intangible but very visceral roots of tradition are, so that in telling stories in the modern world, I can really regard and respect the great wisdom and poetry of great myth tellers of the world, because they were amazing artists. But that I don't draw on a single living tradition or a single community. But I would like to be able to, in my lifetime, not only draw from that sort of unconditional place, but also really influence the sort of reconstruction of oral tradition in the modern world as a source of benefit for us.
Thank you, Laura. And Linda Hess, I mean, you're Hinduism in the great 15th and 16th century poet saints. So this is a very removed body of work, obviously, both literally, time-wise, and mystically. And Laura referred to mysticism. What about the central question today, orality, new media, the end of certain communities where they survived?
Well, first of all, you just said that it's very removed in time. And let me just test that, just to see. There will be some people in this audience who are related to North India enough to be able to finish this sentence. Kahe Kabir Suno! Okay, so you don't have to be in the 15th century to know Kabir's characteristic line of poetry that comes at the end of almost every poem of Kabir, because unlike, say, religious literature and mythic literature of the Euro-American traditions, it's not, dare I say, dead. The Euro-American isn't exactly dead, but it is very, very much alive. It's alive throughout culture and society in very diverse ways and changing and fluid ways. But obviously everybody who has ever even gone to primary school in North India had to learn Kahi Kabir Suno. And what does Suno mean?
Listen.
Listen! Excuse me for shouting. But Kabir is quite unique in this tagline. You know, most of these mystical or devotional poets in the Indian vernaculars had some kind of tagline that referred to themselves as authors, but Kabir's listen is quite unique. So Kabir is the poet I've worked the most on, and we'll be having more on Kabir in this festival. But I started out, just to give a little autobiography as you did, I started out writing poetry, then I got interested in India, then I got trained in literature. So I was trained as a text person, and I went over to India, interested in Indian religion, philosophy, and poetry, and I started studying this religious poetry through texts, of course, and it didn't take very long for me to understand that in India, in North India, in the Hindi region where I was living, all of these texts are embodied, enacted, performed, alive in so many embodied ways. Of course, it's more convenient to stick to a text and it'll get you a PhD and maybe a job more easily than if you get very complicated interests in live performance. But I did become interested in live performance, and I spent quite a few years now, fortunately, with singers who sing this poetry. And so for me, it came in the maybe opposite order from you. As a text-oriented person, I began to open myself up to orality, and it was a real retraining and a coming to life in a very different way. And as to the question, not sure if I got it all from Walter Ong, but he says there's no literature without community, non-controversial. Of course, there's always communities of readers and there's communities of listeners, and their experiences are different. That's one of the things I discovered, that to be getting it through listening is a very different way of experiencing text.
Thank you very much. Christi Merrill, Vijan Data. Explain just a little, in the context of this question also, your passion for him and some of the biography we've heard from you, please. That would be lovely.
Okay, first I'm going to take up what Linda was just saying and turn it a different way with the experiences I've had, and then I'll say more about what those experiences were. My experience is that oral and written traditions blend into each other quite seamlessly, and what it takes is for someone to take up the story and tell it in their own way, in a way that really gets people excited about that interpretation and what they're trying to do with it. So, Vijayan Data is a Rajasthani story writer, and he works from oral tradition. We're doing a session on him at 4:15 if you're interested in hearing more about him and his work. I'll say that I met him originally in Jaipur, and I was teaching in a school run by that was started by Faith Singh, who also started the Jaipur Literature Festival, and it's for me amazing to be here, and I'm coming full circle to be talking about Vijayan Data at the Jaipur Festival in America, in Boulder. So I think this is really lovely. I was volunteering at the Gunther School that was in the Anoki compound in Jaipur, and had this idea that children needed to learn to read English with stories that were from the place where they grew up. Because I had been tutoring kids in other school systems in India where everything was either translated into Hindi from an English textbook from England, and they were reading about the beautiful sunshine, and they would come to me and ask, this person seems happy, but when it's really sunny, then you're dying of dehydration. I don't understand. There were so many things that were alienating in these stories, and I thought, we need stories that are using some of the things that are familiar to them. So I had this great idea, and I was in my early 20s, that I would put together this collection of stories, and I invited different people in from the neighborhood and had them tell stories, and I had the children write versions, and they actually published some of them. But I noticed that at recess, they always went back to the same book, and the same book was a collection by Vijayan Data that he had translated from Rajasthani into Hindi. And when I started asking about this book, they said, this is so well written.
and they would tell the stories to each other. They would read them. That same thing kept happening to me again and again. I was in Ann Arbor, Michigan. There were some activists, and they were telling a story, and I thought, oh, this sounds like a story. I tried translating by Vijayadanda, but I could never get it to be funny in the English version. And then at the end, the storyteller, Shankar Singh, said, this is a story by Vijayadanda that I changed for this occasion. And the same thing had happened to me again and again, including after the collection was published. My students found an Urdu storyteller named Mahmoud Faruqi, who did this beautiful version of a storytelling performance based on my English translation. So it went from Rajasthani to my English translation to this Urdu version. So and let's not forget the Rajasthani storyteller who originally told the version that Vijayadanda listened to. So it went from oral to written to written to oral across 3 different languages. And to me, that is the way that these things can move. And each time, each of us had something very particular invested and made that story really work in terms that made sense to us. And it sounds like to our audience too.
So you talk about the cross-platforming, as it were. Now, Vikram Chandra, thank you very much, Christi Merrill. You are a very accomplished novelist. You're very bound to, or you're very wedded into the art of delivering novels, very successful ones. So tell me, do you feel that you're in some way betraying orality, even though your stories are about storytelling? You are so wedded to prose. You are a consummate storyteller. What is your relationship?
Well, I think in my first novel, I mean, it's very, the story that you read is being typed by a monkey on a typewriter, where somebody else is taking the pages and reading them out on a loudspeaker over a maidan, a field full of kids and an audience. So I guess what I'm doing is using oral structures within the fiction to represent a certain kind of storytelling. And I think in India, the written word, right from the beginning, has been shaped by orality, right? So if you go back to the voiced Vedic hymns, they are the operating system of the universe, right? So you really want to preserve those exactly. So what happens in India is that a very sophisticated set of sciences get developed as Vedanga, limbs of the Veda, etymology, meter, and most importantly, grammar. And the high point of this grammar is in 500 BCE when a man named Parnini writes a grammar called Ashtadhyayi, 8 chapters. And it's sometimes been called the most succinct and most complete grammar of any language, right? And it's not actually a pedagogical grammar. It's a set of about 4,000 rules that run together like an algorithm and transform phonemes and morphemes, units of sound and units of meaning, and generate language. So what he does there is he invents the generative grammar, which now down to our time, we get computer programming languages from, right? It's the same principle. And it's an amazing intellectual feat because this entire thing, you can print it out in normal size font in 40 pages, right? So there's these compression techniques that have been used to make it incredibly small, and that becomes the model for all sutra, right? For every knowledge production in India is based on this idea of the sutra, where you try and cram as much semantic information as you can into the shortest amount of space, right? And so if you expand out the Ashtadhyayi from its compressed form, it grows 6 times. It becomes 6 times larger. If you try and translate it into English, it becomes 1,200 pages long. So what happens because of this, and I should point out then that also that here you have orality, which has an extraordinarily high, sophisticated level of literacy, right? Because he's talking about verb roots, he's talking about sounds, he's talking about phonemes. But there is, at that time in India, a generalized disdain for writing as technology, right? So writing actually doesn't happen until 200 years after this, right? And then when it happens, what they have to deal with is that Ashtadhyayi itself is unintelligible, and you can't make any sense of it if you come to it as a naive reader. It's extraordinarily hard, right? Because of this compression, he's using technical meta language in it. So 400 years later, a man named Patanjali writes the great commentary, Mahabhashya. And a bhashya is a commentary that explains a sutra, right? So the important sutras will always have a commentary. And then perhaps the bhashya will have a commentary about it, which is called the Vartika, right? And then somebody's lecture notes on the Vartika would be called the Vivechana. So there's an entire taxonomy of commentaries relating to other commentaries so that any form of knowledge exists in these web of speaking elements, right? And they're all talking to each other. So it makes no sense to read just Ashtadhyayi, you have to know the entire tradition around it. And I think in that sense, you're also assuming the presence of an interpretive community, because you have to go to a teacher, and the teacher will, over 12 years, teach you how to use the Ashtadhyayi by using 16 other commentaries and commentaries about commentaries. Right? And so down to this day, I think we're talky people, right? We talk a lot. I mean, you know, if you watch Indian news shows on a controversy, instead of the 3 talking heads of Fox TV, you have 16 of them, right? And I'm not exaggerating. And they're all yelling at each other, right?
Well, we'd like some of that here. I'd like some crosstalk from you, actually, not yelling exactly, but a little bit of crosstalk would be good. Any one of you can answer this. If orality is under threat because living communities are under threat, what is to be done about it? Is your work threatened? There's some of the discussion, we talk about the taxonomies, Vikram Chandra. What is to be done? Do you feel threatened? Any one of you answer, please.
I want to take up something that you were just saying and think about the interpretive communities. Because one of the things I noticed is I've been to these storytelling sessions that last for days and days, and a lot of people are familiar with embedded narrative, the way that if you've read 1001 Nights, you get the frame story and stories within stories as you have in your work, and it takes a very sophisticated audience to be able to keep that in mind. That's what I was thinking with what you were just talking about, the layers of commentary. I think we actually are training ourselves to do that today with some of the new media. And to me, when I go back and read things, there are a lot of frame stories, including, I kind of elliptically talked about a frame story that's the title story of the Vijayanandeta stories. That's a traditional story. It's stories within stories, and each of those stories, and the Katha Sagars, when it's become more famous, and Ocean of Stream of Stories shows up in Rushdie's Haroon in the Sea of Stories. You get a lot of these overlapping stories, and people stay with you for those. And I think that we're able to become more complicated and have these overlapping communities more, and I would say it's not dying as long as we take a risk with those audiences. I think every one of us has sort of taken those risks and said that here today, that the people are there, and the audience, whether you think of it as a reader or someone who's there listening to what you're saying, I think each of us has that experience.
Marcia, what about your risks you've taken?
Well, you know, I'm thinking of something which writer Paula Gunn Allen said, which she used this term, told to the page stories. And I would describe the sorts of risks that I take as the risk in what it means to tell a story to the page. The risk, you know, it involves a certain risk to take something, a pool such as music, reggae music, and attempt to translate that to the page. There are all sorts of things which might change or get lost in the process, but there's also a wonderful opportunity for something to spark and for something new to happen as well. And it's that newness which keeps me going. So, you know, you take the risk by attempting this thing, which maybe you don't have a model for necessarily. And then the beauty of creativity is that you never know what will become of it. So I think creativity really thrives on risk, really. That's what it's about.
And Laura, you take lots of risk. A lot of your work is cross-border. I mean, that's inherent risk, isn't it? You're trampling on other, not you personally, but by crossing oralities through borders, you're, you know, up against elements of protectionism, almost, cultural protectionism.
In a strange kind of way, that is not the risk, since I love stories within stories within stories within stories. I like to read it. I like writing that way, and I particularly love performing that way. there's something, the risk for me in performing is that it's, I mean, I am a writer as well, and it's such a different process. I'm not committed to the page. I'm committed to the spontaneous poetry that arises between myself and the audience in my performance. So, I mean, there are things about orality. I mean, no orality really exists without the written word also anymore. We are dependent on each other, and I love everything everybody's saying. There are certain qualities. I'm very, very invested lately in thinking about how the voice, the presence, the sort of reciprocity or attunement of the storyteller in the present moment has the effect on how deeply and how fluidly and flexibly and deeply an audience can respond. And I think the love of frame stories, like devotional singing or like reggae. My son is from West Africa, and I listen to reggae like all the time now.
I'd love, if I may, sorry to cut off, but these are very tight sessions. Audience is responding. Laura just mentioned that. I hope you'll all look them up. I hope you'll find their Twitter accounts and their email. Pick up questions that we haven't had time to deal with today, but we have a few minutes now. Who has a question?
If I can just add, I mean, I might be alone in this, but I don't feel especially threatened in any way.
No.
I think there's people doing more speaking, except it's in writing generally, online, and often the sort of multiplicities of those discussions, especially when they're around something that makes everyone angry, is incredibly various. I mean, when I'm trying to follow some sort of controversy, I often have 16 browser windows open.
Of course, of course.
And so, but
I meant threatened in terms of longevity, in terms of staying power with new media, there's so much talk, there's so many words. How do you know that yours will be the ones that stick going forward?
Well, that's what democracy does, right? Everyone gets a chance to speak. And we worry about, let the future worry about nonsense.
But let's get some questions. We have a very lively audience. I know somebody has a question. You want to say something?
You got a question?
Question? Oh, thank you.
It's more a comment than a question, but I wanted to speak to what Linda said about Kabir and how, even though he was 1500th century, but he's still very relevant. And I just wanted to add to that I was born in Pakistan, and he's not only very much alive in India, he's very much alive in Pakistan, and that I was inspired by Kabir, and right now collaborating on a brand new oral project, which is bringing together writers from India and Pakistan in an oral project with an editor of Ajmal Kamal. And so I think it's very exciting. We live in a very exciting time when orality can actually dissolve borders, and it's a whole new, brave new world out there with orality, with new possibilities with mediums.
Comment, please.
Do you care to comment?
Thank you. Is there anyone you want to answer? Let's get another question and we'll combine them.
It's actually close to yours. In Afghanistan, Kabir is also still alive, but Hafez is probably more so. And I was just wondering if, now Hafez is used for fortune telling in Afghanistan, and someday I'll tell you about the parakeet boys of Kabul. But so I'm wondering if the same thing is true with Kabir and the other mystical poets of India. For fortune telling, yes. For example, yeah, in Iran as well. I don't want to take up the time describing it.
I don't know
okay.
if Kabir is used in fortune telling. There are people who consult Kabir in a very religious, devotional way.
It's more or less the same thing, but yeah. Okay.
Would you like to remind your answers to these questions?
These are specifically on Kabir, so get
More questions? More questions. Okay, let's get this going. I'm very, very blind, so if I miss you, please do some kind of noise.
Hello, this is for any one of you, the question. I just wanted to know how much of the oral tradition would contribute to the passing down of scientific literature. Do you think it is, which I feel that there has to be some kind of an importance where oral tradition is passing down scientific knowledge. So how much do you think that is helping? How much of oral tradition is helping to pass down scientific knowledge? We are only talking about culture of peoples passing down through the traditions.
I mean, I can say that in the pre-modern Indic tradition, learning the sutra by heart was essential, right? That's what you first did, and you learned it by syllable, and then you went and learned how it actually worked. So I mean, and I hated this version of, the modern version of this, which was trying to learn entire textbooks by heart when I was in 6th grade, but I think that still operates in a sense.
Also, I'd say that in traditional cultures, like in certain Native American cultures, a story that we hear that takes an hour might have in tradition taken 6 or 7 hours because of the important knowledge and information that was shared orally that makes it unforgettable and very vivid.
Claudia, there was a question at the back.
Thank you. Right.
This is for Vikram. You mentioned Panini and then to Patanjali. And the compression of the language, the rules, turned into sutras. And is this where Sanskrit maintained its Shakti, its power, and its potency, its virya, through this?
I don't know if I'm quite so willing to get mystical about it, but I think, I mean, I guess the virtue of Sanskrit, but also of a lot of the other Indian languages, is that they're very flexible. And Sanskrit, especially in terms of its relatively free word order, it makes making sutras, which are, there's a technical definition for a sutra. It's not just a thread. It has to be about one thing. It has to be completely clear. It has to make an unambiguous statement. So doing that in verse so that it could lend itself to being memorized meant that you had to have a medium in which that you could actually do that with sophistication and ease. So I think that certainly is a part of the reason that the orality of the tradition remains intact until the present.
We have time for one more question, perhaps from this side of the room. Okay, sorry. We've got 3 minutes.
This is a question for the whole panel. Do you have any suggestions for creating this love for the oral tradition and storytelling for our younger generation? Because this is, you know, almost the love and the creativity is kind of in the baby boomer generation or beyond, and our younger people are so much into the digital media that they do not want to connect to this. So if you have any ideas as to how do we pass on this love?
Well, to defend the young a little bit, they're talking to each other, making reaction videos on YouTube, right? And they're making millions of dollars doing that, right? So that there is a great oral component to the modern digital platforms. I guess, I mean, my quarrel with it is that because of the anonymity, it results in a degradation of the discourse. It's very easy to hurl death threats at somebody whose ideas you don't like because nobody's attaching you to it. But I think there's a lot of talking going on.
Yes, and if you tell great stories from your own life and the great fairy tales and folk tales to children, they imagine it and they are instantly engaged, which makes their minds more flexible, which will make their digital storytelling more remarkable and interesting, and so on.